Hello and welcome to week one of Introduction to Archaeological Illustration. My name is Emile Nelson and I will be your mentor for the next 6 weeks. So before we get started, if you haven't already, please check out the announcements on Google Classroom as I have posted a question on there to try and get to know you all a little before we get into these next 6 weeks. So week one, as is shown in the course outline, will be mostly the history of archaeological illustration. We don't have the time to get too in depth, but if you're interested in a certain person or a certain era of the history of archaeological illustration, you can always email me and I can try to point you towards some good sources or have a chat with you on the subject. So for today's lecture, we will talk about the different periods of archaeological illustration, the medieval, the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and antiquarian, where I will introduce you to a few people, Augustus Pitt Rivers and Stuart Peugeot. We will also get into our main idea for this course, which is why illustrate. So archaeological illustration, while informal and not really under the same name, goes as far back as the medieval era. So at that time, we see a lot of megalithic monuments being depicted in illuminated manuscripts, as in the one shown here, Wace's Roman de Bru from the second half of the 14th century. And you may or may not be able to tell what it is a drawing of. It is a drawing of Stonehenge, actually. So what did early illustrations do? Well, early illustrations mainly aimed to leave a visual impression or illustrate a story, as in the picture below. They were not concerned with accuracy. So due to this, there are a lot of examples of early anthropological illustrations that are heavily biased. Some examples I can give you are illustrations of early man or evolution, early illustrations of Neanderthal, or anyone from the Neolithic period. Also, a lot of illustrations from Mesoamerica, as this wasn't easily accessible to people, and they kind of, I'm going to say, let their imagination run wild a little bit. So as we begin to move into the Renaissance, though, we start to see a change in the purpose and quality of illustration. Of course, during the Renaissance, you have the emergence of scientific inquiry and method, and you also begin to see some catalogues of artifacts. The first catalogues of antiquities pop up during the Renaissance and usually include Greek or Roman artifacts, as they were considered, the height of civilization, classicists and all that. So here's an example of a catalog of columns from the Renaissance. There is also, interestingly enough, a healthy supply of Egyptian illustrations, like this one, for those who can make it out there, or perhaps they were illustrating something that they had been told by somebody else. Now, this one seems to be scientific. You've got some Egyptian arches and drawings of Egyptian mummies, which are actually quite beautiful as early illustrations go. So what did they do with these catalogs of antiquities? Well, not much really, until we move into the Enlightenment era. During the Enlightenment, people had new modes of traveling the world and could now travel to distant lands and record what they found there. You have a plethora of illustrations of Egyptian monuments, Greek and Roman monuments, and structures now being put into these catalogs. However, the drawings weren't always more scientific, as you can see in this image of the pyramids at Giza and the Sphinx. So what can we notice about this image? Well, at first glance, it doesn't seem quite right. We can tell what it's supposed to be, but there are a few things that are a little off. The depth is off. The pyramids aren't really accurate. If you look at the one in the distance compared to the people in the front, it doesn't look that far off yet. It's very small. They're not strictly equilateral triangular structures. They're different shapes, different inclines, and the Sphinx merely looks like the head of a man, but it doesn't look like it's buried in the sand. It looks like it's just sitting right on top. So, and then if you notice, the sky looks as though it's had as much attention paid to it as the rest of the drawing. The drawing isn't trying to be specifically scientific. It's just trying to record information, a moment or a feeling that they were left with upon seeing this. However, it does leave us with a certain impression, right? Especially if you're looking at this in the late 18th or early 19th century. However, one of the most important things to take away from the Enlightenment is that now, with all of these catalogues of things, of antiquities, artifacts could become evidence. So, who's this guy? Well, this is Augustus HLF Pitt Rivers, and he is considered the founder of British archaeology. So, some of you may have heard of the Pitt Rivers Museum in the UK. It's an amazing museum full of artifacts and arranged in a sort of catalog way. It looks a little intimidating at first when you first go in. There's just cabinets of things, but it's actually really interesting the way it's laid out. So Pitt Rivers did a lot of pioneering work in excavation and typology, and even in the very early days of illustration, he was constantly asserting that illustration was, an integral part of archaeology. So Stuart Peugeot. I don't have a picture of him, but Stuart Peugeot was an Abercrombie professor during the antiquarian era and early days of more scientific archaeology. He actually wrote several publications on the history and development of archaeological illustration. And just as Pitt Rivers in the early days, he also saw the value in archaeological illustration. You will see one of his very famous illustrations in the James reading for this week. So to our main idea for the course and our main question, why illustrate? Why is it important? So when you illustrate, you're forced to look at something more carefully to decide what is important to record, because obviously when you're drawing something, you can't record everything. You can't record every angle, you can't record every bump, every mark, you don't have the time, you don't have the money, you don't have the space in your article, so you have to decide what's important. And to do that, you have to look at something very carefully. Next week, we'll get into how you decide what is important to record or what should be recorded for your specific purpose. Of course, a drawing may always be a little more biased than a photograph, but you will be more familiar with the object than just taking a picture of it. You'll be more familiar with the type of objects or site or monument or building, which as an archaeologist is the very idea. You want to be familiar with these things. The more familiar you are with something, the more questions you can ask. And the more questions you can ask, the more you can learn from it. The more you can start a discussion with other people and come up with new ideas and new ways of researching, and you might think of something you may not have thought of. So, thank you for joining us for week 1. It's a little shorter than the rest of the weeks will be, but I just wanted to kind of give you a hard and fast history of the subject. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out and ask. I may not always be able to get right back to you. I don't know where everyone is time-wise. And I've also put the readings up for you on Google Classroom, so you don't have to go and look for them or pay for them or anything like that. So next week, our topic will be the fundamentals of illustration, where we will get into how to draw, key principles for a good and bad illustration, how you decide what needs to be recorded, and all of that. So thank you all for joining, and I will see you all next week.